An 18-year-old girl finished her shift at work and began the walk home, but she never arrived. Police immediately launched a large-scale search, yet despite weeks of investigating, every lead seemed to end in a dead end. Then, a series of astonishing twists changed the entire direction of the case, eventually revealing a truth no one saw coming. Jennifer Teague was born on June 30th, 1987, in Ottawa, Canada. She was the youngest of 3 children, and her 2 older brothers had always been protective of her. After her parents separated, Jennifer moved in with her mother and grandmother, while her father continued living nearby and remained closely involved in her life. As she grew up, Jennifer developed a love for sports. She played baseball and soccer, but hockey was by far her biggest passion. Her bedroom was filled with posters of her favorite hockey stars. Around the same time, she also became deeply interested in environmental conservation and volunteered with a group that visited elementary schools to teach children why protecting nature was so important. By the time she reached high school, Jennifer had started working part-time jobs to earn her own spending money and save for the future. Although she hadn't completely decided what career she wanted, she was considering studying fashion design, while also thinking about pursuing work in environmental protection. In September 2005, at 18 years old, Jennifer began her final year of high school and eagerly looked forward to graduation. Alongside her classes, she continued working evening shifts at a nearby Wendy's restaurant. Around that same time, she adopted a kitten from a local animal shelter and was excited to receive her next paycheck so she could afford its vaccinations. On Wednesday, September 7th, Jennifer arrived home from school, relaxed for a short while, and then left to catch the bus to work for her evening shift. Around midnight, she finished closing the restaurant and began making the trip back home. Since the buses had stopped running for the night, she had no choice but to walk just over a mile. Although it was late, most of the route followed busy, well-lit streets that she had walked countless times before, so she didn't feel particularly unsafe. After clocking out, Jennifer called 2 friends who had also just finished work nearby. They arranged to meet outside a 24-hour convenience store located roughly halfway between her workplace and her home. The 3 spent about an hour talking, laughing, and catching up about their day. Then, at approximately 1:30 a.m., Jennifer said goodbye and started the final 18-minute walk home by herself. She was never seen again. The following evening, Jennifer's mother began growing increasingly concerned. She hadn't heard from her daughter since the previous night. Because Jennifer's bedroom was in the basement, the family rarely saw her when she returned home late after work. Likewise, she usually left early enough for school that everyone else was still asleep. It wasn't unusual for an entire day to pass without them crossing paths. But when Jennifer failed to return home after school and didn't answer any phone calls, concern quickly turned into panic. She was the type of person who always let her family know where she was going. This time, there had been complete silence. Her mother soon discovered Jennifer had never shown up for school that day. Later, she also missed her scheduled shift at Wendy's. At that point, the family knew something was seriously wrong. Jennifer's mother contacted every one of her friends, but none of them had seen or heard from her since the previous night. Her father confirmed that she hadn't reached out to him either. Running out of options, her parents went directly to police and reported her missing. Although Jennifer was legally an adult at 18, investigators treated the case with urgency and immediately launched a search. Officers interviewed her friends, classmates, and co-workers, while family members, neighbors, and volunteers spread out across the area looking for any sign of her. Others printed hundreds of missing person flyers and posted them throughout the community in hopes someone had seen her. One of the first conclusions investigators reached was that Jennifer had almost certainly not run away voluntarily. Everyone who knew her described her as responsible and dependable. She had never disappeared without telling someone where she was going. Detectives then focused on retracing every step she had taken the night she vanished. Her friends explained that Jennifer had left them around 1:30 that morning and walked toward home while they headed in the opposite direction. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered another important detail. Jennifer hadn't been alone immediately after leaving work. A co-worker named Mark had walked with her for part of the journey before she split off to meet her friends at the convenience store. When detectives interviewed Mark, they immediately noticed several fresh scratches across his face, something that instantly caught their attention. Mark claimed he had accidentally cut himself while shaving, and even showed officers the razor he had used. Naturally, that explanation alone wasn't enough to rule him out. Detectives wondered whether the scratches might actually have been inflicted by Jennifer as she fought to defend herself. Even so, there was no physical evidence connecting him to her disappearance. To help verify his account, investigators asked Mark to take a polygraph examination. He agreed without hesitation, and according to the examiner, his results showed no indications of deception. That caused detectives to gradually move away from him as a suspect. Investigators also questioned Jennifer's former boyfriend. He explained that although their relationship had ended, they had remained on good terms. He said he hadn't spoken with Jennifer that night and claimed he had stayed home the entire evening. Like Mark, he voluntarily agreed to a polygraph test, and his results likewise showed no signs that he was being deceptive. With nothing linking him to the disappearance, detectives eliminated him from their suspect list as well. Before long, investigators shifted their focus to another person who had begun attracting their attention. A 21-year-old local named Boris. According to Jennifer's friends, he knew her, and they'd even seen him drive past while they were sitting outside the store that night. Digging deeper, detectives learned that Boris had a troubling reputation. He was known for odd behavior, and in the past had even been accused of stalking women with a restraining order issued against him. People who knew him often described him as paranoid. Jennifer's friends also revealed that shortly before she vanished, Boris had asked her out, and she had turned him down. Armed with this information, detectives went to speak with him. Boris denied having anything to do with Jennifer's disappearance, but he was noticeably nervous and struggled to answer some of their questions. Still, he allowed them to search his car without a warrant. Right away, investigators noticed that one of the windows was shattered. They considered the possibility that it had happened during an abduction, but Boris insisted it had been broken on a different day. He also agreed to a polygraph test, and the examiner reported no signs of lying in his responses. So despite his odd behavior and concerning past, detectives found nothing concrete linking Boris to Jennifer's disappearance. Officers along with Jennifer's family and friends kept searching all over the city, but they couldn't find Jennifer or any trace of her belongings. Meanwhile, a new theory started spreading through Ottawa. Some believed a serial killer might be behind her disappearance. Just 2 years earlier, a woman named Ardeth Wood had vanished on the other side of the city, and days later, her body was discovered in a river. Police had never caught the person responsible, and now people feared that the same predator could be connected to Jennifer's case. With no solid leads, investigators poured everything they had into the search. They set up a command center inside a church near the convenience store where Jennifer was last seen. Hundreds of locals came to help, splitting into groups to comb through different parts of the city. Police brought in search dogs and even used helicopters equipped with heat sensors. Detectives also went door to door, checking every house along Jennifer's route home. Before long, they got a potential lead. A woman who lived on the edge of Jennifer's neighborhood reported hearing a piercing scream around 1:30 that night. She looked out her window, which faced the main road, but didn't see anything suspicious, and chose not to call the police at that time. Now, however, detectives believe that scream may have been Jennifer's. Given the timing and location, it could very well have been the moment she was abducted. Not long after, another neighbor came forward, saying he too had heard the scream that night, But like the first witness, he hadn't seen anything that could point investigators toward a suspect. A week went by with no sign of Jennifer and not a single real lead, and hope of finding her alive was fading fast. That's when detectives officially reclassified the case as a possible homicide, giving them access to even more resources. They held a press conference asking anyone in the city with information to come forward. Jennifer's parents also spoke directly to her presumed captors, pleading with them to let their daughter go. But in the days that followed, the search kept coming up empty. So investigators tried a different approach. Jennifer's neighborhood was mostly made up of private homes with their own yards, and technically, police would have needed a search warrant to search each one. No judge was ever going to sign off on hundreds of properties. So instead, detectives went door to door asking for voluntary permission. Almost everyone agreed, and officers combed through hundreds of yards and houses. But even then, they didn't turn up a single clue. That went on for several more days until everything suddenly changed. On September 18th, a week and a half after Jennifer disappeared, an off-duty officer took his family to a park on the edge of the city. As they walked along a trail, he caught a familiar smell of decomposition and followed it into the woods. Just a few dozen feet from the path, he spotted a human body, partly covered with branches and leaves, and immediately called it in. The remains were turned over to medical examiners since the body was far too decomposed to be identified visually. All of the clothing was missing as well. Investigators suspected it might be Jennifer, so the lead detective made a calculated move. He instructed his team to set up a police tent near the parking lot at the beginning of the trail so the press wouldn't discover the real location. The idea was simple. Only the killer would know the real spot where the body was hidden. Not long after, medical examiners confirmed the remains were indeed Jennifer's, but because of the level of decomposition, they couldn't determine an exact cause of death. Her body was sent to a lab in Toronto for further analysis, but the results were the same. Still, one thing was absolutely clear. This was no accident. It was murder. After Jennifer's body was found, police once again turned to the public for help. This time, they released several dozen surveillance images taken inside the convenience store where Jennifer had spent time with her friends on the night she vanished. Detectives believed her abductor might have been in the store, spotted her there, and then waited for the right moment to follow her home and attack. Investigators worked to identify every person who appeared on the footage, but a handful of men still remained unknown. Around the same time, another possible lead surfaced. After news of the body broke, a witness came forward saying he'd walked through the same park early in the morning on September 8th. He recalled seeing a man standing near the entrance of the trail, and he'd gotten a clear enough look at his face to help police put together a composite sketch. Detectives believed this man was very likely Jennifer's killer, and they hoped someone in the community would recognize him. The problem was, the sketch came out vague, lacking detail, and it could have resembled a lot of different people. That triggered a new flood of tips, but every lead ended in a dead end. To make matters even more frustrating, two separate people actually confessed to killing Jennifer. After careful investigation, police determined both men were lying. Neither had the opportunity to commit the crime. They just wanted the attention. From that point on, the case basically stalled. Tips were coming in less and less often, and police still had no evidence that could bring them any closer to solving Jennifer's murder. Sometime later, investigators got word from their colleagues that the case of Ardeth Wood, the woman killed 2 years earlier, had finally been solved. The killer turned out to be a local man, and detectives immediately looked into whether he could also be responsible for Jennifer's death. But it didn't take long to confirm that he hadn't even been in the city at the time of her abduction. So, any possible connection between the two crimes was ruled out. By early 2006, detectives made a few more pushes to get answers, once again appealing to the public for help, but none of it led anywhere. That's how things stood until June 9th, when detectives got a completely unexpected call. Staff at a local hospital reached out with a bizarre story. A man had run into the street completely naked, screaming, "I killed Jennifer Teague." Police rushed to the hospital, and when they questioned him, he actually admitted that he was the one responsible. But there was one major problem. Tests showed the man had taken 5 times the normal dose of hallucinogenic mushrooms. Once he sobered up, he told investigators he didn't remember anything about making that confession and had no idea why he said it. According to him, he had nothing to do with Jennifer's murder. He only knew about it from the news. He claimed that on the night Jennifer vanished, he had been at a friend's house playing video games. But there was a catch. When detectives went to question the friend, they discovered he'd recently been in a serious accident that left him with partial memory loss. He couldn't recall what happened that night, or even who he'd been with. Still, detectives couldn't ignore the situation and decided to dig deeper. 24-year-old Kevin Davis had no criminal record and worked at a local pizzeria. What stood out most, though, was where he lived, directly across the street from the woman who had reported hearing a scream, and only a few dozen feet from the church where police had set up their command center. As detectives pieced everything together, they stumbled across something striking. It turned out they had already spoken with Kevin in the very first days after Jennifer disappeared. Since he lived in the neighborhood, officers had knocked on his door with their standard questions. Back then, Kevin told them he'd been home all night, and his mother, who was sleeping in the next room, backed up his story. But now, almost a year later, he was claiming he'd actually been at a friend's place playing video games. And that wasn't the only red flag. Reviewing the case files, detectives found a tip that had come in right after Jennifer's body was discovered. Someone had suggested they take a closer look at Kevin because he resembled the composite sketch. At the time, investigators dismissed it as just one of hundreds of leads with nothing concrete to back it up. But now, with his drug-fueled confession combined with all these inconsistencies, Kevin suddenly looked much more suspicious. Still, there was one big problem. There wasn't a single solid piece of evidence against him. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing tying him directly to Jennifer's murder, and Kevin wasn't confessing anymore. With the case hanging in limbo, detectives began wondering how they could ever hold him accountable. For the next few weeks, detectives kept digging, revisiting files, brainstorming new angles, searching for anything they might have missed. But nothing came together. Eventually, they started to fear that Kevin would never be arrested, that he'd slip away and remain free. But then, out of nowhere, everything changed, and in the most unexpected way. On June 26th, just a few weeks after being released from the hospital, Kevin walked up to his neighbor and said he needed help. When the neighbor asked what was wrong, Kevin told him to call the police because he had killed Jennifer Teague. After that, Kevin went to a nearby store where he came across a police officer. He calmly approached him and repeated the same thing. He had murdered Jennifer. He was taken straight to the station, and this time detectives made sure to cover every detail so that Kevin couldn't walk back his confession later. They read him his rights, then brought in medical staff to test his blood for drugs or alcohol. The results came back clean. Only then did they turn on the camera and begin recording as Kevin gave his confession. Kevin told detectives that he carried a deep hatred toward women for most of his life because they never loved him. In the days leading up to Jennifer's murder, he started going out at night, taking his mother's car and driving around with a knife, rope, and a gag. He admitted he was hunting for a vulnerable victim, guided by 2 simple criteria. His victim had to fit a very specific image in his mind. She needed to be young, vulnerable, and easy to overpower. Kevin later admitted that his original intention wasn't murder at all. He planned to kidnap a young woman, take her back to his house, and sexually assault her. According to his confession, 2 devastating events had pushed him over the edge. He had recently lost his job, and not long afterward, his beloved pet died, leaving him emotionally unstable. On the night Jennifer disappeared, Kevin parked his car near the convenience store, where he noticed 3 young women sitting outside, laughing and talking together. He deliberately stayed out of sight of the security cameras and waited patiently for the group to separate. As he sat behind the wheel, he mentally rehearsed exactly how he would carry out the abduction. Around 1:30 a.m., Jennifer said goodbye to her friends and started walking alone toward her neighborhood. Although much of the route was illuminated by streetlights, there were several darker stretches along the way. Kevin chose one of those isolated areas to strike. Armed with a knife, he forced Jennifer into his vehicle and drove her back to his home. Because he still lived with his mother, who was asleep in a nearby bedroom, he knew he had to remain as quiet as possible. Keeping Jennifer under control by threatening her with the knife, he brought her into his bedroom and attempted to sexually assault her. But when he was unable to carry out his plan, his frustration turned into rage. He wrapped his hands around Jennifer's neck and strangled her to death, while his mother slept only a few feet away, completely unaware of what was happening on the other side of the wall. After admitting to the crime, detectives asked Kevin to lead them to Jennifer's body. Without hesitation, he directed them to its exact location. He didn't point to the fake search site police had intentionally created for the media. Instead, he took investigators straight to the real location, one that had never been made public and was known only to the investigative team. That single detail confirmed beyond any doubt that his confession was genuine. Detectives then asked Kevin why he had suddenly decided to come forward, and his explanation caught everyone off guard. He said everything changed after officers visited his house a few weeks earlier. Although they had very little evidence against him, Kevin became convinced his arrest was only a matter of time. His fear quickly spiraled into overwhelming paranoia. He genuinely believed detectives were watching his every move. At one point, while at work, he even ordered a coworker to lift his shirt so he could make sure he wasn't secretly wearing a recording device. Unable to live with the constant anxiety any longer, Kevin concluded that confessing was the only way to end the nightmare. Ironically, he had no idea that investigators actually had no evidence capable of proving his guilt. Had he stayed silent, there's a real possibility he might never have been convicted. Following his confession, Kevin was charged with murder and remained in custody while awaiting trial. From jail, he later attempted to withdraw his confession, but by then it was far too late. The trial began in January 2008, and once again, Kevin chose to plead guilty. Because there was no need for a lengthy trial, the proceedings moved quickly, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving at least 25 years. During his final statement before sentencing, Kevin claimed he deeply regretted what he had done and said he would willingly trade his own life if it meant bringing Jennifer back. Jennifer's father, who was present in the courtroom, wasn't convinced. He later said he didn't believe Kevin's words for a second. In his eyes, the apology felt less like genuine remorse and more like an attempt to appear sympathetic in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence. Ultimately, Kevin was sent to prison to serve his life sentence, with no certainty that he will ever be granted parole after becoming eligible. One final detail makes this story even more meaningful. In 2015, Jennifer's father published a book about the tragedy, sharing not only the investigation, but also how his family found the strength to continue living after such an unimaginable loss. His hope was that others grieving loved ones would find comfort in his story and realize that, even after the darkest moments imaginable, healing is still possible. Let me know your thoughts about this case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like. Let's move on to the next case. A young mother was discovered brutally murdered inside her own home. and from the very beginning, detectives believed they already knew where the investigation was headed. But as they looked closer, the case became increasingly strange, with one puzzling discovery after another. By the time the truth finally emerged, it was so unexpected that it stunned even the veteran investigators who thought they had seen it all. Sarah Williamson was born on June 20th, 1963, in Florida. Because her father served in the military, the family spent part of her childhood living on an army base before eventually settling in Albuquerque, New Mexico. From an early age, Sarah stood out as an exceptionally gifted student, particularly when it came to mathematics. She was later found to have an unusually high IQ, allowing her to earn outstanding grades with very little effort. Outside the classroom, Sarah was an avid reader with a particular love for crime fiction. By the time she reached her later years of high school, she had already begun dreaming of writing her own mystery novel someday. She was also outgoing, full of energy, surrounded by friends, and especially close to her older sister. After graduating, Sarah enrolled at a university near Albuquerque, where she earned a degree in mathematics. During her college years, she met a man named Cohen, and after both of them completed their studies, they got married. Sarah originally intended to continue her education by pursuing a master's degree in statistics. But before she could do that, she received an attractive job offer at a nearby military base. She accepted the position, and after working there for some time, she and her husband relocated to Maryland. There, Sarah landed a prestigious job as a statistical analyst with the National Security Agency, marking a major milestone in her career. She quickly built a reputation as an exceptionally talented analyst who could solve even the most complicated problems. Around the same period, she also began writing the crime novel she had dreamed about for years, centering the story around a statistician who solves a murder case. About 3 years into the marriage, Sarah and Cohen's relationship began falling apart, and the couple eventually divorced. Sarah remained focused on her career at the NSA while finally deciding to pursue the master's degree she had postponed years earlier. She enrolled in evening classes at Johns Hopkins University, where she met another student named Lorenzo. Sarah was 27 years old at the time, while Lorenzo was 25. He was studying business and finance, and like Sarah, he had also gone through a previous marriage. The two quickly grew close, and after Sarah completed her graduate degree, they married. Together, they settled in the affluent community of Elkridge, just outside Baltimore. 3 years later, they welcomed a son into the world. But almost immediately after the baby was born, Lorenzo's behavior began to change dramatically. He became increasingly controlling, constantly monitoring Sarah's actions, while showing very little interest in spending time with their child. Eventually, Sarah decided the marriage could no longer be saved and filed for divorce. Lorenzo moved back into his parents' home nearby, and the former couple agreed that their son would primarily live with Sarah while spending weekends with his father. At that point, Sarah was 35 years old, and her son had just celebrated his first birthday. On Friday, November 13, 1998, Sarah dropped her son off at Lorenzo's house for the weekend before spending the following day with her closest friend, Laura. The next morning, Sunday, Laura expected Sarah to call as they had planned, but the phone never rang. Concerned, Laura repeatedly tried reaching her, but Sarah didn't answer. Then, she noticed she had a voicemail waiting. It had been left at 8:46 the previous evening, long after Laura had already gone to bed. Back then, voicemail systems didn't display the caller's identity unless you listened to the message. Assuming it was probably Sarah, Laura pressed play. What she heard immediately sent chills down her spine. The recording captured confusion, strange background noises, and then the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming as what appeared to be a violent struggle unfolded. It sounded as though someone was being attacked while the voicemail was recording. Horrified, Laura immediately contacted police and begged them to check on her friend. Officers were dispatched to Sarah's home without delay. As soon as they arrived, they noticed that the window beside the front door had been smashed. Oddly, however, the front door itself was still locked, and no one answered when officers knocked. Walking around to the back of the house, they found the sliding glass door unlocked and cautiously entered. Almost immediately, they noticed something that didn't make sense. The alarm system connected to the back door was still armed. If an intruder had entered through the broken front window, the alarm should have been triggered. That inconsistency immediately raised questions. As officers stepped into the living room, they were confronted with a horrifying scene. Sarah's body was lying on the floor, surrounded by an enormous pool of blood. Bloodstains covered the walls, furniture, and even the ceiling, making it clear that an extremely violent attack had taken place. Fearing the worst, officers rushed through the rest of the house, searching desperately for Sarah's young son. Unaware that he was safely staying with his father, they initially feared the child had also become a victim or had been abducted. While Sarah's body was transported to the medical examiner for an autopsy, detectives began carefully examining every inch of the crime scene. Their initial assessment suggested the killer had likely entered through the shattered front window. That window, however, was also connected to the home's security alarm, adding yet another mystery investigators would need to explain. But the sensor was on the frame, so it would only trigger if the window was opened. Smashing the glass didn't set it off. Bloody fingerprints showed that the intruder also used the same window to leave. Inside, investigators noticed something strange. Someone had pulled out all the Beets tapes from a drawer in the living room and scattered them across the floor, and the VCR itself was missing. In the kitchen, every cabinet door had been thrown open, like someone was searching for something specific. At first glance, it looked like a burglary, but detectives quickly started to doubt that theory. Sarah's laptop and wallet were sitting untouched on the kitchen table. It felt more like someone had staged the scene to look like a break-in, covering up a much darker motive. The autopsy only reinforced that suspicion. Sarah had been stabbed repeatedly with wounds across her entire body. The sheer level of violence suggested deep personal anger or hatred toward her. Detectives also couldn't figure out why the killer chose to smash the front window. The back of the house faced the woods and would have offered a much safer way in without drawing attention. That led them to believe the attacker might have known exactly how the alarm system worked and realized that breaking the back door glass would have likely triggered it. Forensics didn't find any usable fingerprints or solid evidence. All they could do was gather up the huge amounts of blood left behind, hoping that somewhere in the mess they might pick up traces of the killer's DNA if he'd cut himself during the brutal attack. Meanwhile, officers searched the backyard and discovered a machete, which they believed was the murder weapon. Forensics later confirmed that the wounds on Sarah's body matched it exactly. While experts worked through the evidence, detectives confirmed that Sarah's little boy was safe with his father. With that worry off the table, they turned their focus to interviewing Sarah's friends and family. They wanted to know if she'd had any conflicts leading up to her death. But everyone said the same thing. Sarah was kind, easygoing, and never fought with anyone. The only exception was her ex-husband, Lorenzo. Sarah's best friend, Laura, explained to investigators that the divorce had been rough. After their son was born, Lorenzo's behavior completely changed. He had been on antidepressants before, but stopped taking them once the baby arrived. From then on, Sarah noticed he showed no interest in spending time with her son. But that wasn't all. Lorenzo also grew controlling, watching her every move. Over time, Sarah started to feel like he was angry at her for giving more attention to their newborn than to him. Sometime later, after Sarah went back to work, Lorenzo started accusing her of having an affair with her boss. He even showed up at her workplace. Since she worked for the NSA, his accusations triggered a full-scale internal investigation and interviews with dozens of employees. In the end, investigators found absolutely no evidence to back up his claims. Still, Lorenzo refused to let it go. During one of their fights, he even pulled a gun on Sarah. That was the breaking point, and she filed for divorce. When Lorenzo found out about it, he tried to hit her while she was holding their baby. Sarah fell, and Lorenzo snatched the child and walked out. He dropped the baby off at his parents' house, then came back and told Sarah she had to sleep with him or she'd never see her son again. After that, Sarah went straight to the police and got a restraining order against him. But no other action was taken. From then on, she only saw him in court where they were battling over custody, or when she dropped their son off at Lorenzo's parents' house on weekends, since the court ruled he had visitation rights. At one point, Lorenzo even tried to get a passport for his son so he could take him out of the country. But the court shut that down. Sarah's sister later revealed that just one day before the murder, Sarah had called her and said she was genuinely afraid of Lorenzo. She was worried he might hurt her before the court made a final decision about custody of their son. Sarah even asked her sister to look after the child if anything ever happened to her, because she didn't want Lorenzo raising him. That alone was enough for detectives to take a closer look at Lorenzo. So, they went to speak with him. When they told him Sarah had been found dead, he dropped to his knees, covered his face with his hands, and started screaming. Once he calmed down, investigators began asking questions. Lorenzo denied any involvement and insisted they should look into her boss, claiming Sarah had been having an affair with him. As for himself, he said he was at home that night, and his whole family backed him up. Detectives knew that kind of alibi wasn't rock solid. Family members could easily be covering for him. They took his DNA and fingerprints and also checked him for any scratches that might have come from a struggle, but he didn't have a single mark on him. They then got a warrant to search Lorenzo's house and car, but once again came up empty. No blood, no shoes matching the prints left in Sarah's house, and no other evidence that could tie him to the crime. In the end, Lorenzo hired a strong defense attorney, which forced detectives to shift their focus. They decided to check out Sarah's former boss, but by then, he had already left the NSA and moved away. When the NSA learned about Sarah's murder, they decided to assign their own team to investigate the case alongside local police. They reached out to Sarah's former boss, and once again, he insisted that their relationship had been strictly professional. He also said that, on the night of the murder, he was having dinner with friends in another state, and that alibi checked out. With no other real leads, detectives tried to squeeze more information out of the voicemail Sarah had left her friend in the middle of the attack. They were hoping to catch the killer's voice, but instead, they picked up something else. After experts cleaned up the recording, investigators thought they could hear Sarah screaming the name Mike. That immediately raised a red flag because Lorenzo's brother was named Michelangelo, but he went by Mike. He lived in the same house with Lorenzo and their parents, and according to him, he'd been home the night Sarah was killed. Detectives started wondering if Mike might have carried out the murder himself, maybe to make sure the child stayed in their family. They brought him in for questioning and played the enhanced tape for him, but he said he couldn't hear his name on it at all. And to be fair, the theory was shaky from the start because even on the cleaned-up version, the recording was so unclear that you couldn't make out any distinct words. Mike denied having anything to do with the murder, but during questioning, detectives noticed he was visibly shaking, and when they drove him back home, the moment he stepped out of the car, he immediately threw up. It all looked suspicious, so the lead detective gave him his phone number and told him to call if he ever decided to come clean. But instead, Lorenzo's attorney reached out to police and said that, from now on, they'd only be allowed to speak to his brother in the presence of a lawyer. After that, detectives checked out Sarah's first husband as well as Lorenzo's ex-wife, but both were cleared. As for Lorenzo's ex-wife, investigators asked if she'd be willing to help them, and she agreed. Police tapped her phone and she called Lorenzo, carefully trying to coax something new out of him. But he stuck to his original story and kept insisting he had no idea who killed Sarah. There was also another theory tied to Sarah's job at the NSA. She had access to classified information, and detectives couldn't rule out that this might have been a motive. But the special team from the NSA looked into it and ultimately concluded there was no connection between her work and the crime. A month after the murder, the lab finally finished processing all the evidence from Sarah's house, and they found DNA from an unidentified man in 3 different blood samples. Detectives immediately compared it to Lorenzo's DNA, and to their surprise, it wasn't a match. The same went for his brother and his father. The blood didn't belong to any of them. This twist shocked investigators, who had been almost certain Lorenzo was involved. But now, with the DNA pointing to a completely different man, his guilt didn't look so clear anymore. The problem was, without any other leads, there was no way to figure out who the real killer was. And the case went cold for months. Detectives kept digging, even checking known serial offenders in the area, but nothing came of it. Later, they sent the voicemail recording to the FBI, where experts were able to clean it up more effectively. Turned out, Sarah hadn't said Mike at all. It was just a scream. That went on for 7 months until the case suddenly took a shocking turn. On June 1st, 1999, the lead detective got a call from the Baltimore County Police Department. An officer there explained that one of their inmates had just confessed to killing Sarah. The inmate was a 19-year-old named Ardeth Wood, who'd been arrested 3 months earlier for an armed robbery at a McDonald's. While sitting in jail awaiting trial, he told his cellmate that he'd murdered a woman in her own home. The cellmate quickly struck a deal with prosecutors, wore a wire, and started asking Ardeth for details about the killing. Ardeth explained how he'd broken into the house through a window and attacked the victim with a machete. He described her injuries with such precision that detectives had no doubt he was talking about Sarah. He even gave the exact date it happened, the night she was killed. Ardeth bragged about how his victim died while he kept striking her, saying he wanted her to suffer as much as possible. Finally, when his cellmate asked why he'd done it, Ardeth gave an answer that floored detectives. He said a former coworker had paid him $5,000 to kill her. Investigators were convinced he wasn't lying about being the killer. His confession included details that had never been released to the public. The lead detective headed straight to the jail to confront him. He told Ardeth he'd be facing first-degree murder charges and made it clear that they already had his confession on tape, so he'd better start talking. Ardeth didn't deny a thing. He admitted he had killed the woman without even knowing her name. He added that he didn't feel any remorse because, according to him, Sarah was a bad person. He claimed the former coworker who hired him for the job told him that Sarah once pushed a pregnant black woman down a flight of stairs and spit in her face. Ardeth also said that instead of the promised $5,000, he only got $3,000, but the money didn't matter to him as much as punishing her for what she'd supposedly done. At that point, the detectives laid out 3 photos: Lorenzo, his brother, and his father, and asked Ardeth which one of them had hired him. To his surprise, Ardeth didn't recognize any of them. He explained that the person who hired him wasn't a man at all, but a woman. Though he didn't know her name, that raised even more questions. How could he have worked with this woman and not even know who she was? And what kind of woman would want Sarah dead? One thing was clear, though. This woman knew Sarah very well. According to Ardeth, just days before the murder, she drove Ardeth to Sarah's house and told him the best time to strike would be Saturday, because Sarah would be home alone. She even explained how her alarm system was set up and warned him not to tamper with it so the neighbors wouldn't hear a thing. With this new lead in hand, detectives shifted their focus to finding the woman behind it all. Ardeth had worked at a nursing home laundry in Baltimore. So, police pulled the employee roster, hoping he'd recognize someone. But what they stumbled across was far more shocking. One name on that list instantly told them who the mysterious woman was. Her name was Amelia, and she was Lorenzo's mother. Detectives went back to the jail and showed Ardeth a photo of Amelia. Without hesitation, he confirmed that she was the one who had hired him. What really stunned him, though, was learning that Amelia wasn't just some stranger. She was Sarah's mother-in-law. He explained that Amelia often brought the little boy to work, and he'd assumed she was just the child's babysitter. When he realized that the boy was actually Sarah's son, Ardeth was floored. He said the only reason he agreed to the murder was because he believed Sarah was racist, and he thought he was punishing her for that. But now he understood he'd been manipulated from the very start. Of course, there was no one doing what he had already done, and for detectives, the real challenge was still ahead. Ardeth's confession alone wasn't enough to put Amelia away. They needed hard evidence to prove she'd orchestrated the murder. While interviewing employees at the nursing home, detectives finally found someone willing to talk. One female co-worker agreed to cooperate after being promised full immunity. She revealed that on the day Sarah was murdered, Ardeth had approached her with an unusual request. Because he was too young to rent a vehicle himself, he asked her to rent one for him, joking that she was helping him become a killer. She laughed it off, believing he wasn't serious, and handed over the rental car anyway. Several hours later, Ardeth returned the vehicle, but something immediately caught her attention. His boots were covered in blood. He calmly told her he had gotten rid of the devil and asked for her assistance. Together they drove to an empty lot where they set his blood-stained boots on fire in an attempt to destroy the evidence. While heading back, their car was stopped by two police officers. During the search, officers discovered a knife hidden beneath the seat, and there was blood visible on its handle. Surprisingly, instead of arresting either of them, the officers simply confiscated the knife and allowed them to leave. As detectives continued digging into the case, they uncovered another suspicious detail. Just a few weeks before Sarah's murder, Amelia had withdrawn $2,500 in cash from her bank account. Not long afterward, Ardeth deposited almost the exact same amount into his own account. The timing and nearly identical sums were impossible to ignore. Investigators then sent DNA recovered from the machete to the crime lab, where forensic experts compared it to Ardeth's genetic profile. The results came back as a perfect match. Armed with that evidence, detectives formally charged Ardeth with murder. Their attention then shifted to Amelia. She was brought in for questioning, and while sitting at the station, she phoned her son, Lorenzo. During the conversation, she calmly told him she believed she was about to go to prison. Oddly, Lorenzo never asked why. His unusually composed reaction immediately caught detectives' attention. After ending the call, Amelia refused to answer any further questions and requested an attorney. Investigators knew the evidence against her was largely circumstantial and worried it might not be enough to secure a conviction. So the lead detective decided to take a calculated risk. He falsely told Amelia that if they proved Lorenzo had known anything about the murder, the family would lose custody of Sarah's son forever. Amelia sat alone in the interrogation room for several hours, thinking it over. Eventually, she changed her mind. She waived her right to legal counsel and agreed to tell detectives everything. Amelia admitted she had never truly liked Sarah, describing her as ungrateful and disrespectful. According to her, tensions only escalated after Sarah's son was born. Amelia believed Sarah wasn't raising the child properly, but every attempt to offer advice was rejected. As the months passed, their disagreements became increasingly bitter. When Sarah eventually filed for divorce from Lorenzo, Amelia became convinced she would lose access to her grandson forever. That fear consumed her, and she admitted she wanted revenge. Even so, Amelia insisted she never intended for Sarah to be murdered. She claimed that while venting her frustrations to Ardeth at work, he encouraged her to retaliate against Sarah for the way she had treated the family. According to Amelia, Ardeth volunteered to handle it himself, assuring her that he only planned to throw rocks at Sarah's house to frighten her. Detectives found that explanation extremely difficult to believe, especially considering Amelia had paid him thousands of dollars, far more money than anyone would expect, for a simple act of vandalism. Amelia also maintained that no one else in the family, including Lorenzo, had any knowledge of the plan. Despite an extensive investigation, detectives were never able to uncover evidence proving otherwise. With the case assembled, prosecutors moved forward to trial. Ardeth was the first to appear in court. His defense claimed Amelia had manipulated him into killing an innocent woman, and he even told the jury he had spent months praying for Sarah and her family. The jurors remained unconvinced. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amelia's trial followed in January 2000. Not a single member of her family attended the proceedings. Her attorney argued that prosecutors lacked direct evidence tying her to the murder itself. But the mountain of circumstantial evidence proved too overwhelming to overcome. The jury found her guilty as well, and she received the same sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Nearly a decade later, in 2009, Amelia appealed her conviction, stating that Sarah never deserved to die and claiming she had forgiven her long ago. The court found nothing in her appeal that justified overturning the verdict, and her sentence remained unchanged. Following Sarah's death, her young son continued living with his father. Lorenzo eventually remarried and went on to have 3 more children. He passed away on February 8, 2023, at the age of 57. Amelia, now 89 years old, continues serving her life sentence. Ardeth later became eligible for parole, but when he appeared before the parole board in 2024, his request for release was denied. He remains behind bars to this day. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like. Let's move on to the next case. A dedicated nurse finished her shift and headed home, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening, but she never made it through her front door. When police first arrived, there were almost no clues to explain what had happened, making the case seem nearly impossible to solve. However, as investigators began digging deeper, they uncovered a series of strange and unsettling details that completely changed the direction of the investigation, and in the end, the truth proved to be something no one had seen coming. Michelle Beets was born on February 22, 1953, in New Zealand, where she grew up with an older brother, 2 younger sisters, and loving parents who always encouraged her ambitions. She was known as a cheerful, outgoing child who loved horseback riding, swimming, and spending time with friends. At just 13 years old, Michelle earned a place at a prestigious girls' school, where she excelled academically. From an early age, she dreamed of helping people through medicine, so she devoted herself to her education and eventually completed her medical training before beginning work at a hospital in Auckland. Later, seeking a new chapter in life, she moved to Sydney, Australia, where she continued her nursing career at a major hospital. Around the same time, she met a man named David, and the two soon began a relationship. Through years of dedication, compassion, and hard work, Michelle rose through the ranks to become the hospital's head of nursing, earning such a respected reputation that she was even chosen to serve on the medical team responsible for caring for the Pope during his visit to Australia. On April 27, 2010, 57-year-old Michelle followed her normal routine, leaving for work early in the morning and finishing her shift around 6 p.m. Before driving home, she stopped at a nearby shopping center to pick up a few groceries. At approximately 6:20 that evening, a couple walking their dog on Michelle's street suddenly heard a woman screaming. They rushed toward the sound and arrived just in time to see a man wearing a hoodie, a balaclava, and a backpack climbing out of Michelle's yard. They attempted to stop him, but he fled before they could catch him. As they approached the house, they found Michelle lying on the front veranda. When they checked on her, they saw a deep wound across her throat. Although she was still alive and turned toward them as if trying to speak, her injuries were too severe for her to make a sound. Tragically, she died before emergency responders could save her. Detectives quickly confirmed Michelle's identity and discovered that, in addition to the fatal wound to her neck, she had suffered multiple stab wounds and had clearly fought desperately against her attacker. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with a burglary that had gone horribly wrong. It appeared Michelle had interrupted an intruder the moment she arrived home carrying her groceries, and the back door showed obvious signs of forced entry. But that theory quickly began to unravel. Despite the damaged door, there was no evidence that anyone had searched the house, and nothing had been stolen. Then detectives made an even more disturbing discovery. The power lines outside the home had been deliberately cut before the attack, disabling both the electricity and the alarm system. The security company immediately detected the outage and tried calling Michelle at home and on her cell phone, but she never answered. They then contacted David, who explained he was only minutes away and would check on her himself. By the time he arrived, the street was already filled with police cars and ambulances. As officers informed him that Michelle had been murdered, he collapsed from the shock. Given the sheer violence of the attack and the planning involved, detectives quickly became convinced the murder was personal rather than random, making David their first person of interest, especially since he had admitted to being nearby when the attack took place. But soon, they confirmed his alibi. He'd been in another place during the attack, and there wasn't a single trace of blood on him. So, police cleared him and kept searching for new leads. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to go on. The crime scene offered almost nothing, just a few faint smudged footprints leading from the house toward a nearby street. Since that matched the direction in which witnesses said the suspect had fled, officers began pulling footage from hundreds of surveillance cameras along the route and beyond. Meanwhile, news of Michelle's murder spread quickly across the city, and it sent shockwaves through her neighborhood. It was an upscale, peaceful area where crime was virtually unheard of, and even petty thefts were rare. Since the killer had left behind almost no trace, detectives started to wonder if this wasn't his first crime, or if he might have had experience in law enforcement or even military. They also suspected he'd been watching Michelle for a while, learning her daily routine. He'd cut the wires leading into the house, which also disabled the motion-activated lights on the veranda. That seemed deliberate. By the time Michelle got home, it was already getting dark, and without that light, the killer could easily hide near the door and wait for her to arrive. While officers combed through surveillance footage looking for the suspect, detectives began interviewing Michelle's friends and colleagues. Staff at the hospital where she worked said there had been issues in the past with certain patients who'd harassed nurses, but investigators found no link between those incidents and Michelle's murder. They also learned that Michelle had once fired an employee for stealing prescription drugs from the hospital storage room, but that lead too went nowhere. However, as detectives kept talking to her co-workers, one name kept coming up again and again. A man named Walter, whose behavior, everyone said, had always been strange. Walter was originally from the United States. He'd come to Australia on a work visa and got a job as a nurse at the same hospital where Michelle worked. She was actually his supervisor, the one who signed off on his employment papers. But just a few months before the murder, Michelle decided not to renew his contract after multiple complaints had been filed against him. Several nurses had reported his inappropriate behavior, and overall, staff were afraid of him. He had a reputation for being short-tempered and unpredictable. In fact, Michelle even asked a colleague to stay in the room with her when she broke the news to Walter that he was being let go, because she was genuinely worried about how he might react. But that wasn't the end of it. After he was fired, Michelle told co-workers she'd seen Walter near her house several times, which understandably terrified her. Detectives quickly realized that Walter might have been stalking her in the days leading up to the murder. They also learned that he had previously served in the U.S. Marine Corps and had extensive combat training. Still, when investigators questioned him, Walter denied having anything to do with Michelle's death. He claimed there had never been any bad blood between them. He said he didn't hold a grudge about losing his job and barely even knew her since. According to him, they hardly ever interacted at work. Other hospital employees, however, told a very different story. They said Walter and Michelle saw each other almost every day and that there was definite tension between them. Walter also insisted that he had no reason to hate her, since the only reason he'd wanted to keep the job in the first place was for his visa. But even after being fired, he managed to keep it and continued living in Australia legally. As for the night of the murder, Walter said he'd met his wife at the train station around 7 p.m. and that they'd went home together. He swore he'd never been anywhere near Michelle's house that evening. Police searched his house, but came up empty. Even so, Walter was still their prime suspect. They just didn't have the evidence to nail him yet. And then, just days after Michelle's murder, something eerie happened. Walter ended up in the very same hospital he'd been fired from. He'd suffered some kind of seizure, and the staff, Michelle's own colleagues, had to treat the man. Everyone already suspected might have killed her. Meanwhile, detectives kept going through hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, and eventually they caught a break. On one of the recordings from a shopping center less than a mile from Michelle's house, they spotted a man who looked a lot like Walter. The timestamp showed he was there just 10 minutes after the murder. But that wasn't all. The footage also showed him tossing his backpack into a trash bin before walking away. When investigators brought Walter back in and showed him the footage, he didn't seem nervous at all. He admitted it was him on the video, but said he just stopped by the mall to run some errands and that the backpack was old, something he'd been meaning to throw away for a while. Police sent crews out to multiple landfill sites across the city, trying to track down that bag, but came up empty-handed. Despite all the suspicious details, detectives still didn't have enough to charge him with anything. For the next few weeks, investigators struggled to find any new leads. It was starting to look like the killer had completely covered his tracks and that justice might never come. But then, 3 weeks after the murder, everything changed in the most unexpected way. Walter's wife, Samantha, came forward and told police she was ready to testify against her husband in exchange for full immunity. According to his wife, Walter hated Michelle for not renewing his contract. He also believed she'd given bad references about him to other hospitals, which made it impossible for him to find another job. He complained about Michelle to his wife, insulted her, and eventually started talking about getting revenge. At first, he told his wife he just wanted to scare Michelle in a very odd way. He said he'd dress up as a Mormon and go to her house to silently hand her a religious pamphlet. Pretty quickly, he shifted into darker territory, claiming he worked for some secret Irish organization that had finally given him permission to kill, and that he'd be paid a lot of money to do it. In the weeks before Michelle's death, he began preparing. He watched her, learning her routines and routes, and called her home phone from Payawances more than 30 times to figure out when she was home. He even drove past her house to watch her, often not even trying to hide, and Michelle said she'd spotted him several times. His wife also told police that Walter practiced knife strikes on her and her brother, focusing on how to cut a throat silently, a technique she said he'd learned in the military. He'd take the knife every morning when he woke up, and again before bed, just sitting and staring at it. A few days before the murder, he bought a whole outfit from a thrift store, including gloves, and paid in cash, so the purchase couldn't be traced. On the day of the murder, Walter did meet his wife, but not at the train station. They met at the same shopping center, where he later threw away his backpack. When she tried to kiss him, he told her not to touch him because he was dirty, then admitted he had just killed Michelle. Walter said he broke a window at Michelle's house and tried to pry open the back door to make it look like a break-in. He also cut the wires leading to the house to disable the porch lights and waited for her to come home. But despite all that planning, something went wrong. Walter had intended to ambush Michelle from behind. But that evening, her car broke down, so she had to park on a different spot. When she finally stepped onto the porch, she saw him and screamed. Walter told her he wouldn't hurt her if she stayed quiet. Michelle said, "Okay, I won't scream. I'm just afraid you'll hurt me." Right after that, Walter slashed her throat and stabbed her several times in the upper body. When he saw a couple running toward the house after hearing the scream, he fled. He changed clothes behind a nearby garage, stuffed his bloody outfit and knife into his backpack, and threw it away at the mall. Samantha explained that she hadn't gone to the police sooner because she was terrified, afraid that if she talked, Walter would kill her too. Around that same time, detectives got a call from a journalist who said she had some interesting information to share. She told them she'd met Walter in the early days of the investigation. Right after reporters learned that police were starting to suspect him, she got his phone number, and over the next 2 weeks, they spoke several times. During all those conversations, Walter kept insisting he was innocent until one day he called her again and said he needed to tell her something unpleasant. He admitted that he had killed Michelle, saying it was a contract killing for a large amount of money. Walter claimed he'd been diagnosed with cancer and wanted to make sure his wife had enough money to return to her home country, Vietnam, and start a business there. The journalist immediately contacted detectives who, as it turned out, were already interviewing Walter's wife at that very moment. Her brother also confirmed that Walter had practiced knife attacks on him and even asked him to come along to Michelle's house to act as a lookout during the murder. That was all the police needed to make an arrest. Walter was charged with murder, but refused to plead guilty, and he was sent to jail to await trial. A few months later, guards found him in his cell bleeding heavily and rushed him to the hospital where doctors managed to save his life. It turned out Walter had done it to himself, so he was placed under close supervision. Roughly 18 months after Michelle's murder, Walter finally stood trial, but he continued to deny any involvement. Throughout the proceedings, he appeared detached and uninterested, rarely reacting to the testimony or evidence presented, instead allowing his attorney to handle nearly everything. His defense argued that prosecutors had failed to produce any physical evidence placing Walter at the crime scene. They also attacked the credibility of the prosecution's key witnesses, his wife, Samantha, and her brother, claiming both had powerful incentives to fabricate their stories. According to the defense, the pair had been granted complete immunity from prosecution and promised Australian visas in exchange for their cooperation, giving them every reason to tell investigators exactly what they wanted to hear. Walter's lawyer also argued that a serious brain injury from a car accident 2 years before the murder may have affected his judgment and mental state. However, court-appointed medical experts had already evaluated him and found no evidence of any neurological or psychological condition that would reduce his criminal responsibility. In the end, the prosecution relied primarily on Samantha's testimony, her brother's account, and the available security footage. Although no fingerprints or other forensic evidence directly connected Walter to the murder, prosecutors argued that the overwhelming circumstantial evidence painted a clear and convincing picture of his guilt. They maintained that Walter's motive was straightforward. After Michelle refused to renew his employment contract, he became consumed by anger and decided to retaliate. The jury ultimately agreed, finding him guilty of murder. In March 2012, Walter was sentenced to life imprisonment. Even as the verdict was read, he displayed virtually no emotion. When the judge instructed him to stand, he appeared not to respond until his lawyer repeated the request. Yet throughout the trial, Walter frequently smiled and made unsettling gestures toward Michelle's family seated in the courtroom, behavior that only deepened the discomfort surrounding the case. After his conviction, investigators uncovered additional details about his past. Before moving to Australia, Walter had been married in the United States and had a child there. Records showed he owed more than $50,000 in unpaid child support, providing another reason he was desperate to keep his Australian visa and avoid returning home. Detectives also discovered that only weeks before Michelle's murder, Walter had traveled to the United States with the apparent intention of killing his ex-wife. For reasons that remain unclear, he abandoned that plan, returned to Australia, and ultimately turned his attention toward Michelle instead. Investigators also thoroughly examined Walter's extraordinary claims of working for a secret Irish intelligence organization, but found absolutely nothing to support the story. The same was true of his repeated claims that he had terminal cancer. There wasn't a single medical record confirming such a diagnosis. In 2015, Walter appealed his conviction, arguing that prosecutors had unfairly highlighted his military background during the trial. But the appeal was rejected, leaving his life sentence unchanged. He remained behind bars until 5 years later, when prison guards discovered him dead inside his cell. An autopsy later concluded that he had taken his own life, bringing the criminal case to its final chapter. Even so, certain aspects of the investigation continue to raise questions. One detail many people find unusual is how precisely Samantha described every stage of the murder, almost as though she had witnessed it firsthand. It's possible Walter intentionally shared every detail with her, knowing he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison and hoping that by cooperating with authorities, she could secure immunity and an Australian visa. That theory could also explain why Samantha waited nearly 3 weeks before approaching police and immediately negotiated for legal protection and immigration benefits. While those questions may never be answered, one thing remains certain: Michelle's legacy endured long after her death. In 2012, the New South Wales government established an annual award in her name to recognize healthcare professionals who have made exceptional contributions to children's medical care. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more true crime stories. Let's move on to the next case. A young university student went out for a bike ride one afternoon, but she never returned home. What started as a missing person case quickly turned into one of the largest search operations the city had ever witnessed, drawing national attention and leaving investigators scrambling for answers. Detectives followed thousands of leads, interviewed countless witnesses, and looked closely at hundreds of possible suspects, yet every promising clue seemed to lead nowhere. For months, the case remained a mystery until an unexpected breakthrough finally uncovered the disturbing truth. Ardeth Wood was born on October 28, 1975, in St. John's, Canada. A few years later, she became the older sister to 2 boys, and eventually the family settled in Ottawa. Ardeth attended Catholic schools while growing up, and later enrolled at university, where she focused her studies on history and philosophy. After completing her undergraduate education, she continued pursuing her academic goals and moved near Toronto to begin work on a PhD in philosophy. She was deeply committed to her studies and hoped to one day become a professor at a respected university. Her instructors often praised her intelligence and maturity, sometimes feeling as though they were speaking with a fellow academic rather than a student. Outside of school, Ardeth lived an active lifestyle. She enjoyed running, swimming, and cycling, and she also dreamed of starting a large family of her own one day. At the time, she was in a serious relationship and planned to marry her boyfriend after completing her doctoral studies. In the summer of 2003, at 27 years old, Ardeth returned to Ottawa to spend 2 weeks with her family. Since her university was nearly 300 miles away, opportunities to visit home were limited, and being away from her close-knit family had always been difficult for her. She wanted to make the most of every moment during her visit. On the morning of August 6th, she started the day with a run before returning home and making a strawberry dessert for her parents and brothers. Later, she and her mother planned to go shopping together. But weather reports warned that heavy rain was approaching. Wanting to get outside before the storm arrived, Ardeth decided to go for a bike ride. She borrowed her brother's bicycle, told her mother she would be back in about 90 minutes, and headed out. As the afternoon went on, dark clouds rolled in and the forecasted rain finally arrived. But Ardeth still had not come home. At first, her mother assumed she had simply taken shelter somewhere and was waiting for the weather to improve. But when the rain stopped and there was still no sign of her, concern quickly turned into fear. Her mother called her husband, who immediately gathered their sons and began searching for Ardeth. They drove along Ottawa's extensive network of bike paths, particularly the popular trail system where Ardeth and her brothers had spent countless hours cycling when they were younger. The problem was that nobody knew exactly where she had gone. She hadn't told anyone which route she planned to take before leaving. Despite searching for hours, her father and brothers found nothing. As evening approached and daylight began to fade, panic set in. More than 6 hours had passed since Ardeth had left the house, and her family became convinced that something was seriously wrong. They contacted police, but because Ardeth was an adult, authorities did not immediately launch a large-scale search operation. Refusing to sit back and wait, her family began contacting friends, neighbors, and anyone willing to help. Soon, dozens of volunteers were searching trails and parks throughout the city late into the night. Yet there was still no trace of her. One of the biggest challenges was Ottawa's massive trail network, which stretched for well over 100 miles. Without knowing which route Ardeth had chosen, searchers had little choice but to focus on the paths closest to her family home. The following morning, police officially joined the effort and established a command center near the Aviation Museum, where several major cycling routes connected. Officers were deployed across the city, and investigators appealed to the public for assistance. Photos of Ardeth were distributed to local newspapers and television stations, while residents were encouraged to join the search. The response was immediate. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers were helping look for her. Mounted police units were brought in, helicopters searched from above, and even military personnel assisted with the operation. Before long, the search for Ardeth became one of the largest missing person investigations Ottawa had ever seen. Despite the enormous effort, however, no evidence of her whereabouts was found. As media coverage intensified, the case spread rapidly throughout the city and beyond. Police received hundreds of calls from people claiming to have seen something suspicious. During those first few days, several women contacted investigators with stories that immediately caught their attention. Each woman described being approached by a man under unusual circumstances, and according to their accounts, the descriptions all seemed to point to the very same individual. They explained that he would approach them on bike paths or park trails that ran along the river, not far from the very spot where police had set up their command post. One woman told officers that he rode up to her on a bike, and at first he seemed very nice. He was fit, good-looking, and started off with casual small talk. But then, out of nowhere, he tried to pull her off her bike and drag her into the trees. Terrified, she managed to break free and sped away. Based on her account, police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect, but they decided not to release it to the public. They were already overwhelmed with tips, And without solid evidence to connect him to Ardeth's disappearance, putting out the sketch would only create even more noise. Even if someone recognized him and gave them a name, they'd have no way to prove the link. So, they held off. But in the following days, more women came forward with nearly identical stories. A man matching the same description approached them in local parks, acted strangely, and in some cases, even tried to drag them off the trail into the woods. Another lead came from a 16-year-old girl who had been riding her bike in the park. She told police that she'd seen Ardeth's photo on the news and immediately recognized her because she'd actually spotted her in the park on the day she vanished. She rode past Ardeth, but just a few seconds later, heard a woman scream. When she turned around, she saw Ardeth standing with a man, and it looked like they were arguing. She kept going, but when she looked back again, she saw the man walking into the woods with Ardeth beside him. Something about it didn't feel right, so she circled back. By the time she returned, though, they were gone. Curious, but uneasy, she went a little further into the trees. First, she noticed a hat hanging on a branch. Then, just a few steps later, she came across 2 bikes lying on the ground. But there was no sign of Ardeth or the man, and at that point, she decided not to go any deeper. She convinced herself she might just be overthinking things, that maybe she'd only witnessed a couple having an argument. As she rode away, though, she thought she heard another scream. She couldn't be sure if it was real or if her mind was playing tricks on her. When police later showed her the composite sketch created from the other women's descriptions, she confirmed that it looked a lot like the man she saw with Ardeth that day. This pushed detectives towards the theory that Ardeth had been abducted, and now they had a better idea of where it might have happened. They swept through the park with hundreds of volunteers and even brought in divers to search the long, narrow river running through the area. 4 days after Ardeth went missing, the effort finally paid off. Divers pulled a bike from the bottom of the river, and the serial number confirmed it belonged to Ardeth's brother. At that point, detectives realized the chances of finding her alive were slim, and they shifted all their focus to the riverbanks. That same day, police got a call unlike any of the tips they'd received before. On the other end of the line was a man who sounded panicked. He said he had accidentally killed Ardeth near a bike path. According to him, it wasn't planned. It was some kind of accident. He went on to say that afterward, he partially buried her body near the riverbank and covered it with branches. Investigators traced the call and learned it had come from a payphone in a nearby town. They rushed to the scene, hoping the caller might have left behind fingerprints or DNA on the phone. But once again, they came up empty. Meanwhile, police brought in search dogs to comb both sides of the river where Ardeth's bike had turned up. And the very next day, the dogs led them to a body lying just a few feet from the water, partially hidden under branches. The decomposition was so advanced that investigators couldn't identify it by sight, and there were no clothes on it. But they knew almost instantly it had to be Ardeth. They turned the remains over to medical examiners and combed the crime scene, but there was nothing. No footprints, no belongings, nothing that could point them toward a suspect. Later, medical experts confirmed the victim was Ardeth. They determined she had drowned, most likely held underwater until she died. Afterward, her killer dragged her onto the riverbank and tried to cover her with branches. Since police couldn't find any of her clothing, it was clear the killer had taken it with him. Examiners couldn't say for sure if Ardeth had been sexually assaulted, but everything about the scene pointed strongly in that direction. After Ardeth's body was found, investigators decided to release the composite sketch of the suspect, and it triggered a flood of new tips. Many women said a man matching that description had harassed them in local parks, but none of it brought police closer to putting a name to the face. Over time, detectives built a list of several hundred possible suspects, checking each one carefully, but still couldn't tie anyone directly to Ardeth's murder. They also looked into the possibility that a serial offender was responsible. the same man who had assaulted several women in the nearby town where the confession call to police had come from. That predator had attacked multiple women just a year earlier and was never caught. Detectives tried hard to link the two cases, but once again, they hit a dead end. Even so, tips kept flooding in, and investigators were struck by how many women had run into a man who looked like the composite sketch. But when they pieced it all together, they realized he'd been spotted in that very park at least 19 times in the week before Ardeth disappeared. Even more chilling, one woman saw him the day after the murder before Ardeth's body had been discovered. Detectives believed he might have returned to the scene to hide the body better, or to collect evidence before police could find it. There was one more detail witnesses kept bringing up. Many of them said the man had an eagle tattoo on his shoulder. At first, detectives kept that information to themselves because it was their strongest lead. But as the weeks dragged on and they were no closer to making an arrest, they decided to release it to the public. As a result, hundreds of calls came in about men with similar tattoos. Detectives followed up on every single one, but once again, it led nowhere. In the months that followed, detectives kept working through the flood of tips, more than 4,000 in total. They tried to chase down every lead, which was an overwhelming task. Eventually, though, two specific calls caught their attention. One came in shortly after Ardeth's body was found, and the other arrived months later. But both callers pointed to the same man, a local who lived in the same town where the confession call had been made from that payphone. In fact, he lived in the very neighborhood where that payphone stood. On top of that, he had a criminal record, and he had a bird tattoo on his shoulder that matched what witnesses described. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and his behavior was strange. At one point, he even told them they'd never figure out what he was doing on the day Ardeth was killed, because he was as elusive as a scorpion. Investigators grilled him for 3 hours, but he gave them nothing useful. So, they called him back for a second interview, this time with a polygraph. By then, detectives were nearly convinced this was their guy, but the results completely blindsided them. The polygraph examiner didn't flag a single lie. With no hard evidence to hold the suspect on, detectives had no choice but to let him go. And the clean polygraph results left them questioning whether he was really their suspect after all. Over time, the flood of tips finally dried up. But detectives kept going through the old ones one by one. A year after the murder, their lead investigator told reporters that they were still working through their suspect list, which had around 400 men on it. Most had already been ruled out, but a chunk of them were still question marks. Police also put up a $50,000 reward, the biggest ever put up in Ottawa at the time. But not even that was enough to bring them any closer to finding the killer. By the 2-year mark, detectives had run out of leads, and the case basically went cold. That's how it stayed until September 2005, when another young woman vanished in Ottawa. 18-year-old Jennifer Teague. Investigators immediately looked for a possible link since the two cases seemed so similar. But in the end, no connection was ever found. After that, the case sat cold for almost another year, and detectives were beginning to doubt they'd ever solve it. They had no physical evidence, and despite all the eyewitness accounts, they still couldn't put a name to the mysterious man seen in the park. But then, on May 2006, everything suddenly changed. Police in North Bay, a city about 190 miles from Ottawa, got a call from an attempted assault. A woman reported that she was walking home late at night when a man approached her and asked if he could walk with her. She said no and kept going, but he followed claiming he needed help. He told her he had just moved from Ottawa and couldn't find the address he was looking for. As she started giving him directions, the man suddenly grabbed her and dragged her into the bushes. He tried to assault her, but the woman screamed and nearby residents heard it. One man even ran outside with a shovel and scared the attacker off. The suspect bolted, dropping his phone as he ran. That mistake cost him dearly. Police quickly tracked him down and arrested him. The man was 25-year-old Christopher Myers, who had only recently moved to North Bay from Ottawa. While preparing the case against him, the lead detective suddenly remembered hearing about the Ardeth Wood case at a police conference. He dug out the handouts from that event, and among them was a composite sketch of the suspect. The resemblance to Christopher was uncanny. He immediately passed the tip on to investigators in Ottawa, who started taking a closer look at Myers. The first thing they realized was that police had actually spoken to Christopher in the early weeks after Ardeth's disappearance. An anonymous tipster had called the hotline and named him as a suspect. Detectives had checked him out, but found nothing solid linking him to the crime. He even seemed to have an alibi. The woman who rented him a room said she'd seen him earlier in the day, and by 3 p.m., he had already left for his work shift. Since Ardeth was believed to have been attacked around 1:30, it seemed likely he simply wouldn't have had the time to be in the park. About a year later, Christopher's name popped up again when another tip came in. This time, police decided to take a closer look at him and brought him in for questioning. He denied having anything to do with Ardeth's murder, and even showed them his shoulders to prove he had no tattoos. Something that made detectives doubt whether he really was their guy. But now, with Christopher back on their radar for the third time, and given the fact that he had just tried to drag another woman into the bushes, detectives started seeing him as their prime suspect. The problem was, they still needed hard evidence to prove it. The first thing they did was revisit his alibi. Originally, his landlady had told police she saw him at home during the day, which seemed to clear him. But when investigators went back and spoke with her again, she clarified that she had actually seen him in the morning. That small detail changed everything. It meant that he had plenty of time to ride his bike from his house to the park, attack Ardeth, and still make it to his afternoon shift. To be sure, police even retraced the entire route by bike themselves and confirmed it was absolutely possible. Eventually, detectives went to the neighboring city to question Christopher. At first, he flat out denied having anything to do with it. But when they told him that multiple women had spotted him in the park, his story started to change. He admitted he'd been riding his bike there that day, and even claimed he ran into Ardeth and struck up a conversation with her. According to Christopher, after a brief chat, Ardeth supposedly agreed to walk with him into the woods by the river. But then, he claimed another girl appeared spooking Ardeth and causing her to fall into the water. He said he left right away, but later came back only to find her already drowned. That's when he claimed he pulled her body onto the shore, covered it with branches, and simply walked away without telling anyone what had happened. Detectives knew the story was complete nonsense, but at the same time, Christopher had just admitted to having contact with Ardeth on the day of the murder. What's more, the other girl in his tale sounded a lot like the 16-year-old witness who reported hearing a scream and spotting Ardeth with a man before they vanished into the woods. It turned out Christopher had taken details from the news and reshaped them into a story that made it sound like he had been there. But not long after, he changed his version once again. This time, he claimed none of it was true. He insisted he had never even been inside the park and said everything he told detectives was simply made up using information he had seen in news reports. Investigators then asked him to take a polygraph test, and he failed it. Even after that, Christopher continued claiming he had nothing to do with Ardeth's murder. Without solid forensic evidence connecting him to the crime, detectives still couldn't charge him. While Christopher remained locked up in a neighboring city on unrelated charges, investigators turned their attention to his background, hoping something from his past would strengthen their case. They discovered that his biological mother had abused drugs and alcohol during pregnancy, leaving him with serious developmental and mental health problems from an early age. His childhood only became more troubled after that. He was physically abused until the age of 4, when he was adopted by another family. But even they eventually reached a breaking point. By the time Christopher was 12 years old, his behavior had become so disturbing that they could no longer care for him. He regularly talked to himself, wandered around in public without clothes, and became increasingly aggressive toward those around him. One psychologist who evaluated him later admitted Christopher was the most frightening child he had ever treated. As an adult, however, his life appeared much more ordinary from the outside. He managed to keep a steady job, rented his own place, and aside from a few minor arrests, stayed mostly out of trouble with police. He also had several girlfriends over the years, and detectives began tracking them down to learn more about him. One former girlfriend described Christopher as someone who could become violently angry without warning, and admitted he had assaulted her on several occasions. She also confirmed that he spent a huge amount of time riding his bicycle through local parks. Then, she revealed something detectives had been desperate to hear. Christopher often gave himself temporary tattoos, and more than once she had seen an eagle tattoo on his shoulder. That single detail changed everything. Until then, investigators had worried the eyewitness descriptions might not match the real offender. If Christopher had never worn an eagle tattoo, one of the strongest witness accounts would have completely fallen apart. But with someone close to him confirming that the tattoo did exist, detectives became convinced they finally had the right suspect. Even so, that evidence alone still wasn't enough to bring a murder case before a jury. What they really needed was Christopher to confess. 5 months after his arrest in the attempted assault case, detectives brought him back in for another interview. This time, they brought in an experienced investigator from the United Kingdom, someone known for persuading reluctant suspects to talk. At first, Christopher denied everything once again. But after hours of questioning, he returned to the same strange story he had told before. He claimed he met Ardeth near the river, kissed her, and that she accidentally drowned after becoming frightened by another girl nearby. Then, almost immediately, he took the entire story back and insisted none of it had happened. Not long afterward, though, he surprised detectives by drawing a map showing where he claimed he first met Ardeth and where the two of them supposedly walked together. He even agreed to take investigators to those locations. But as soon as they arrived at the park, Christopher suddenly changed his story again, claiming he didn't recognize the area at all. Although it wasn't a full confession, his contradictory statements were enough to keep investigators focused on him. At the same time, detectives were developing another theory. They believed Christopher might not only be responsible for Ardeth's murder, but also for several unsolved sexual assaults that had taken place across Ottawa during the same period. The attacks followed a similar pattern every time. A man would approach women in public, start a casual conversation, and then suddenly assault them. Investigators showed Christopher's photograph to several victims, and multiple women immediately identified him as the attacker without hesitation. Armed with those identifications, detectives questioned Christopher once again. After hours of interrogation, he finally admitted responsibility for 5 separate sexual assaults. Those confessions gave police the additional charges they needed and significantly strengthened the overall case against him in Ardeth's murder. Eventually, Christopher was formally charged with murder, and the case finally moved toward trial. After years of legal proceedings, prosecutors offered him a plea agreement in January 2008. If he pleaded guilty, the charge would be reduced from first-degree murder to second-degree murder. Christopher accepted the deal. He admitted that he approached Ardeth while she was riding her bicycle, forced her into a wooded area intending to sexually assault her, and ultimately drowned her in the river. He also pleaded guilty to several of the other attacks against women. He received a life sentence, although the agreement allowed him to apply for parole after serving 10 years. That did not guarantee his release. When Christopher became eligible for parole in 2015, the board rejected his request. He applied again in 2020, but once more he was denied. Experts concluded that despite spending 15 years behind bars, he still posed a high risk of committing violent crimes if released. Christopher remains in prison today, and the chances of him ever being granted parole appear extremely small. Ardeth Wood's murder remains one of Ottawa's most well-known criminal cases and left a lasting impact on the community. For years afterward, many women were afraid to ride bicycles or even walk alone through local parks. Residents responded by organizing volunteer patrols, with groups cycling together along the city's trails to improve safety and reassure the public. Investigators have also said they believe Christopher committed more assaults than the ones he admitted to. Unfortunately, many victims never got a clear look at their attacker's face, making it impossible to connect every unsolved case to him with certainty. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe. Let's move on to the next case. A woman failed to arrive at work one morning, and before long, police were called in. From the very beginning, detectives found themselves at a standstill. The scene was filled with evidence, yet none of it pointed them toward a clear suspect, and the investigation remained unsolved for years. But when the mystery was finally unraveled, the truth was so unbelievable that it stunned everyone involved. Leslie Jennings was born on October 5, 1952, in Rhode Island. She grew up as one of 8 siblings, and because her father served in the military, the family relocated frequently throughout her childhood. When Leslie was 12, they settled in Pensacola, Florida, where she completed high school. She later attended the University of Florida, pursuing a degree in journalism, and it was there that she met a young man named Carl. In 1974, at the age of 22, Leslie married him, and 3 years later they welcomed their daughter, Lauren. Eventually, the family moved to Chevy Chase, a quiet suburb just outside Washington, D.C., where Leslie began working at an advertising agency. Over the years, she built a peaceful and predictable life. On the morning of May 2, 2001, 48-year-old Leslie was expected to arrive at work by 10 a.m., but she never came. By around 10:30, her manager became concerned. Leslie had always been dependable and had never missed work without notifying anyone. He checked the emergency contact list and called her daughter. But Lauren was away at college and hadn't spoken to her mother that morning. With no answers, the manager reached out to Leslie's husband. Carl said he had left home around 7:30 a.m. while Leslie was still getting ready. Normally, she would leave shortly afterward, walk to the bus stop, and take the bus into Washington, a commute that usually lasted about an hour. By then, she should have already been at the office. Carl tried calling the house, but no one answered. Fearing that something was wrong, he immediately drove home, while Leslie's boss did the same out of growing concern. They arrived at the house at roughly 11:30 a.m. and stepped inside. Almost immediately, they noticed the front door was unlocked, and the house was eerily quiet. As they moved farther in, they spotted what looked like blood smeared along the hallway walls, with bloody footprints leading across the floor. Leslie's boss quickly dialed 911 while Carl searched the home. He found their dog locked inside the basement, but Leslie was nowhere to be found. The dispatcher instructed both men to leave the house immediately to avoid contaminating any evidence, and they waited outside with the dog until officers arrived. Police reached the scene within minutes and began a systematic search. Upstairs, they made a horrifying discovery. Leslie's body was lying face down inside the shower stall in the bathroom. Based on her position, investigators believed she had been killed somewhere else in the house before being dragged upstairs. It appeared the killer had intended to wash away blood and any possible DNA evidence. Crime scene investigators also noticed clear signs that someone had attempted to clean blood from the hallway and nearby floor. Additional bloodstains were found in the kitchen sink, downstairs bathroom, and even on the trash can, showing that the killer had remained inside the house after the attack, trying to erase the evidence. But considering the sheer amount of blood left behind, the cleanup effort had clearly failed. One detail especially caught investigators' attention. Cleaning chemicals had been used throughout the scene, yet none of those products belonged in the house. That suggested the attacker had brought them along, indicating the cleanup had been planned in advance. Despite all of these suspicious findings, the local police department initially decided there wasn't enough evidence to officially rule the case a homicide. Instead, they waited for the medical examiner's report, leaving open the possibility that Leslie's death had somehow been accidental. One theory suggested she might have slipped while cleaning the bathroom, although that explanation didn't fit the physical evidence. Because of that decision, the home wasn't processed with the urgency of a murder scene. Critical evidence was overlooked, including blood found on a doorframe that investigators never bothered to swab. Meanwhile, news of Leslie's death spread rapidly through the community, leaving residents stunned. Chevy Chase was known as one of the safest communities in the country, where murders were almost unheard of. As days passed without answers, the lack of information from investigators only deepened the fear and uncertainty. 2 days later, the autopsy results finally arrived and erased any remaining doubt. Leslie had been murdered. She suffered 7 separate head wounds caused by repeated impacts against a hard object with sharp edges. Investigators later matched those injuries to the sharp corners of the hallway baseboards, concluding that the attacker had knocked her to the ground before repeatedly slamming her head into them. Her body also showed numerous abrasions from a violent struggle, along with unmistakable signs of strangulation. The findings confirmed what detectives had suspected from the beginning. Leslie had been attacked and killed in the hallway before her body was dragged upstairs in an attempt to destroy the evidence. Forensic teams collected every blood sample they could find throughout the home and sent them for DNA testing. With the case now officially classified as a homicide, detectives launched a full-scale investigation. While waiting for the lab results, they interviewed Leslie's family, friends, and co-workers. No one could think of anyone who might have wanted to harm her. She was well-liked, avoided conflict, and had no known enemies. As with most investigations, detectives first examined her husband, Carl. He repeated that he had left for work around 7:30 that morning, and a neighbor confirmed seeing him drive away after waving towards someone standing at the window. His co-workers also verified that he arrived at work on time and remained there until he received the phone call from Leslie's boss. Unless he had somehow killed her before leaving the house, his timeline appeared to hold up. Detectives also noticed he had no cuts, bruises, or scratches, injuries they would have expected considering the defensive wounds Leslie suffered during the attack. On top of that, everyone who knew the couple described their marriage as loving, stable, and free of any serious problems. A short time later, the lab results came back. Forensics had identified foreign DNA mixed with Leslie's blood in 3 different spots throughout the house. They also found bits of skin under her fingernails, pointing to the same unknown individual. The problem was the DNA didn't match anyone in the database. Testing against Carl's DNA also came back negative. Detectives went on to collect samples from several other men who knew Leslie, but none of those were a match either. There were no other solid leads at the crime scene, and detectives quickly hit a wall. They tried piecing together a timeline and realized the killer had just a little over 2 hours to break into the house, carry out the murder, attempt a cleanup, and then get away. Since the blood hadn't been fully washed off, investigators even considered the possibility that the killer might still have been inside when Carl and Leslie's boss showed up. Maybe he spotted them through a window and slipped out the back door before they came in. With no real evidence or motive to go on, police started looking into whether Leslie's case could be tied to a string of burglaries in the area. But that theory went nowhere. A short time later, the county pulled together a special task force to review unsolved murders across nearby towns. There were 6 in total, and investigators thought they might be connected. In the end, though, that link was ruled out. For months after, the case went nowhere. Detectives kept running down different suspects, but every lead fizzled out. One of the biggest problems was motive. The killer hadn't stolen anything valuable from the house, and there was no sign of personal grudges. Leslie simply didn't have enemies. To detectives, it all looked like a completely random killing, a crime with no real sense behind it. From that point on, the case went cold for years, and detectives made no progress toward an arrest. Some people still believed the killer had to be Carl, that somehow he'd managed to outsmart investigators and walk away free. But Leslie's daughter never once believed her father was guilty. She stood by him through it all. That continued until 2017, when Carl passed away of natural causes. Later, his daughter said he died of a broken heart, never knowing who had taken his wife from him. In 2022, 21 years after Leslie's murder, the local police department put together a special cold case team. They reopened her case, but the killer's DNA still wasn't showing up in the FBI's genetic database. So, detectives went back over everything. They re-entered everyone connected to the investigation, and once again reached out to the public, hoping that after all these years, someone might finally come forward with new information. But once again, nothing. That's when investigators decided to try a new approach. They sent the existing DNA samples to a company which specialized in genetic genealogy. The way it works is pretty simple and complicated at the same time. Investigators take an unknown DNA sample and run it through public genealogy databases where people upload their own results. Almost every time, at least one relative pops up, even if it's a distant one. From there, experts build out family trees and trace them back to the most likely suspect, narrowing it down by things like age, location, and other details. The experts at Aram got to work, and before long they managed to identify a relative of the killer, a man living in Romania. The connection turned out to be pretty distant. So, it took another 2 years of digging through family trees before they finally got close to a real suspect. By 2024, they had zeroed in on a family that had been living in Leslie's town at the time of the murder. Their last name was Glee. And the moment detectives heard it, they realized it wasn't unfamiliar. Looking back through the old case files, they found a tip that had come in nearly a year after the murder, pointing directly at a man named Eugene Gligor, a former neighbor. But that wasn't all. Detectives also discovered that Eugene had once dated the victim's daughter, Lauren. The two had been together for about 5 years. They first met in high school when they were both 15. Eugene lived just a 10-minute walk from Lauren's house, and he spent a lot of time there. Leslie thought he was a great guy, but Lauren's father never trusted him. He always said there was something off about Eugene, though he could never quite explain what it was. When they turned 20 and Lauren left for college, the relationship started to fizzle out, and eventually they broke up. It was a clean break. Eugene didn't seem bitter or angry, and from that point on, Lauren barely stayed in touch with him. Over the years, though, Eugene racked up a string of arrests for illegal weapons possession, theft, and drunk driving. What made it strange was that he came from a well-off family and didn't need to steal cheap things from other people's homes. Still, none of those charges were serious enough to require him to submit a DNA sample, which explained why his profile was never in the FBI database. There was also another troubling incident that dated back to when Eugene and Lauren were 16. A woman had been attacked by a teenager, and she gave police a description that closely matched Eugene. He denied it, and none of his friends could imagine him doing something like that. In fact, Lauren and one of her friends even went down to the police station themselves to vouch for him, insisting he was completely harmless. At the time of Leslie's murder, Eugene was just 21. Detectives also uncovered another interesting detail. Only 2 months after the killing, he and his mother moved to Washington, D.C. From then on, he stayed off the radar, never getting into trouble again. What stood out was that even though a neighbor had tipped police off about him back in 2002, detectives never actually spoke to him about Leslie's case. But now, with his name flagged by the genealogical search, Eugene instantly became their prime suspect. By 2024, he was still living in D.C. and working for a company that sold surveillance equipment. Investigators started thinking about how to get a sample of his DNA, and that's when they learned he was due to return from Europe on June 9, 2024. They came up with a plan and reached out to airport staff for help. The plan was simple. A border officer pulled Eugene aside for what looked like a routine check. On the table nearby, they'd set out a few bottles of water, and Eugene casually grabbed one. A little later, he tossed the empty bottle into the trash, and detectives moved in right away. They collected it and sent it straight to the lab. Forensic experts swabbed the bottle for DNA and compared it to the genetic material found under Leslie's fingernails. It was a perfect match. That meant one thing: Leslie had scratched Eugene during the attack, leaving his DNA behind at the scene of her murder. With that undeniable evidence, detectives finally had their killer. A few days later, police approached Eugene outside his apartment and placed him under arrest. They brought Eugene in for questioning, and at first, the detectives kept things basic, asking when he'd last spoken to his ex-girlfriend or her mother, and whether he'd ever set foot in their house after the breakup. Eugene acted confused, like he didn't even know what they were talking about. And eventually, he asked for a lawyer. That was when the detective finally revealed the evidence they had been holding back. Eugene's DNA had been identified inside the victim's home. The moment he heard those words, he froze. Clearly caught off guard, he insisted he had never provided a DNA sample in his entire life. Struggling to find an explanation, he nervously claimed he couldn't remember anything and said he had no idea what to tell them. The detectives reminded him that if he wanted an attorney present, the interview would have to stop until one arrived. Eugene hesitated before asking if he could call his girlfriend for advice because he didn't know what to do. It was obvious he was falling apart. His hands shook uncontrollably, his voice cracked, and he appeared to break down in tears. He argued that they were treating him as guilty before he had ever stood trial. But one of the detectives noticed something unusual. Despite all the sobbing, not a single tear actually ran down his face. She pointed it out immediately. Eugene quickly tried to explain it away, saying he was dehydrated and his eyes were too dry to produce tears. Within moments, his composure completely collapsed. He complained that his bloodshot eyes were only from being exhausted and emotionally drained, then accused the detectives of trying to frame him, while once again insisting he couldn't remember anything. By the time the interrogation ended, investigators were more convinced than ever that they had the right man. His forced display of emotion and constantly shifting explanations only strengthened their suspicions. More importantly, the overwhelming amount of his DNA recovered from the crime scene meant they didn't need a confession. Soon afterward, Eugene was formally charged with first-degree murder. His arrest stunned many people who knew him. Friends and relatives described him as friendly, cheerful, and generous, someone who regularly donated to charities and actively participated in community events. But not everyone was caught off guard. One of his former girlfriends revealed that during arguments, he would suddenly explode with rage throwing objects across the room and punching holes through walls. Even his own brother admitted he had always been afraid of Eugene, believing he was capable of serious violence. Meanwhile, Lauren struggled to accept the truth. The thought that her former boyfriend had murdered her mother was almost impossible to comprehend. She remembered seeing Eugene shortly after Leslie's death and telling him what had happened. He had hugged her and quietly said he was sorry, never revealing that investigators would later accuse him of being the killer. Preparing the case for trial took nearly another year, and by May 2025, prosecutors offered Eugene a plea agreement. If he admitted guilt, the first-degree murder charge would be reduced to second-degree murder, acknowledging that the killing had not been premeditated and reducing the maximum possible sentence to 30 years in prison. Eugene accepted the deal and pleaded guilty. However, the agreement came with one major limitation. He was never required to explain what had actually happened or why he killed Leslie. Even today, his motive remains unknown. Detectives questioned him repeatedly, hoping he would finally reveal the truth, but he refused to say another word. Investigators eventually developed their own theory. They believe the crime may have begun as a burglary that spiraled out of control. Eugene had previously been connected to multiple theft investigations, leading detectives to suspect he intended to steal from the Jennings home. Since he was familiar with the house, it would have seemed like an easy target. They believe he may have assumed no one was home, only to unexpectedly encounter Leslie. Because she knew him personally, he couldn't risk being identified, and in a moment of panic, he may have decided to kill her. Still, that explanation leaves important questions unanswered. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house, making it unclear how Eugene got inside. One possibility is that he simply knocked on the door, and because Leslie had known him for years, she let him in without hesitation. If that's what happened, the attack could have started almost immediately in the hallway. But if robbery truly wasn't the motive, then what was? And if his intention had been to murder her from the beginning, why didn't he arrive carrying a weapon? Those questions have never been answered, and unless Eugene eventually decides to speak, the real reason behind Leslie's murder may remain a mystery forever. In late August 2025, he was sentenced to 22 years in prison, yet even then he refused to explain why he had taken her life. The case also sparked serious criticism of the police department. Investigators had actually received a tip mentioning Eugene's name only a year after the murder, but for reasons that have never been explained, they never interviewed him or collected his DNA. Had they done so back in 2002, the case might have been solved decades earlier. Unfortunately, that opportunity was lost forever. Even so, the investigation ultimately made history as the first case in Maryland to be solved using genetic genealogy, a groundbreaking technique that has since helped investigators solve hundreds of cold cases across the United States. Let me know what you think about this incredible case in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like.